Hi everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the series I'm doing on the Major Arcana. Today is the day for the ninth card, the Hermit, which of course looks like this. The Hermit is um, a particularly masculine card. We're supposed to think of it as such because its letter is the letter Yod, but at the same time it is also a very feminine sign, um, given the fact that its astrological attribution is Virgo. So this can lead to some confusion, but basically the idea is that it is on the path that connects Chesed to Tiphareth, and essentially those are both fairly masculine ideas. Chesed is on the pillar of mercy, which is the traditionally masculine pillar of the Sephiroth, and of course Tiferet is associated with Christ-like gods who are usually seen as masculine. Technically, at the heart of all technicalities, Tifereth is really more androgynous than anything else. But because it is solar, it is distinctly masculine at the same time. If you have to conceptualize it as any gender, you would conceptualize it as masculine. Um, and just because it's more of an active force and it's a life-sustaining force, and therefore it's sort of phallic in nature. Not literally associated with the phallus, of course, but of that same sort of male generative power. So we are definitely dealing with that with the Hermit, and the Hermit also being connected to Chesed, the mercy of God, and the number 4. It is also about construction. You know, we've talked about how Chesed versus Geburah, Chesed is construction versus Geburah is deconstruction, and so it's got this idea of growth, and again construction and accumulation, which is interesting because the Hermit as Virgo, the sign of Virgo, uh, that Virgo is associated very much with the body and with health often, with growth and personal development. Uh, Virgo itself is a very interesting sign because it is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is also exalted in it. It is the only sign out of the 12 where it has one planet both ruling it and which is exalted in it as well. Um, so it has a very strong mercurial aspect. Not mercurial as in the adjective, but as the word mercurial as in changing. But it has a strong connection to Mercury. Um, so Mercury, of course, is associated with the logos factor. This is a word that I use a lot, but it's very relevant when talking about all these Neoplatonic, cabalistic type things. Um, the logos being, again, the word of God or the will of God. The word and the will are essentially synonymous with each other. There really is no difference. Um, and the idea is that the word and the will are both generative and creative. It's what fashions something out of nothing or something out of chaos. Um, so it's also an organizing and rational principle. So Virgo is traditionally known to be very practical, pragmatic. And the interesting thing is that she's also associated with the virtue of prudence. Now, in the Middle Ages and in medieval Christian writing, it was pretty common knowledge that the virtue of prudence is synonymous with wisdom, that the two are really synonyms for each other. Um, so for them, it's sort of like, for us, prudence has this connotation of down-to-earth practical knowledge. And for them, it wasn't necessarily that. It also had this very lofty goal to it, or understanding to it. And of course, wisdom is the name of Chokmah, which is the father, which is also known in terms of the Tetragrammaton as the Yod of Tetragrammaton. So again, we have these strong masculine influences. So because of course when you place Tetragrammaton in the Tree of Life, Yod is at Chokmah, the Hey primal is at Bina, the Vav is at Tiferet, and the Hey final is at Malkut. So we have all these Yod aspects here. And the Yod itself as a letter, if you can sort of see it, it's at the bottom here. I don't know how good that quality is, but it's just like this little, almost like a little squiggle, but it's considered the basis for most of the other Hebrew letters. It's sort of like the building block of all of them. So that's also a major aspect of this, returning to the idea of the logos. It is also associated with the with the male creative seed, and this is why we have the very obvious, he calls it the spermatozoon, which is a very nice way of saying sperm cell, coming up from the bottom. And he tells us, or Crowley tells us, that this is his wand, interestingly enough. And as you can see, which is sort of amusing, you can see a little baby in the sperm cell. This goes back to a very old belief that, or sort of an archaic common belief before really the discovery of how cells work. But the idea that a sperm cell basically contained a very, very, very minute, completely constructed human being. And this was called a homunculus. So this tiny, tiny human being that just grew in size in the womb. So it's kind of hilarious, in my opinion. But that's what he's decided to show for us here. And if you really look at it, he's got a diamond on his head. The diamond is a symbol of Keter. So the idea is that this spermatozoon, I suppose, has within it a complete entity of itself and is a monad unto itself. It is the creation of the individual, essentially. And of course that also connects to Tiphareth, which is the center of ego consciousness, and the sun. So returning to the idea that this is Mercury, Mercury is also the god of whose function it is to guide the souls of the dead through the underworld. Excuse me, Mercury is seen as what is called a psychopomp. Psycho coming from psyche, meaning soul, and pomp meaning, I believe, procession of some kind. So psychopomp is any mythological deity who acts as either a mediator between the living and the dead, or who is a guide for the dead in any capacity. So Mercury is known for that. And so in some ways we can see this as a card that represents the transition from death into life, or vice versa, and having this serpentine kind of flux quality. But we can also see it as relating to the legend of Persephone, going back to the Virgo thing. Of course, this card has a lot of different layers of symbolism, but they all actually make sense together, unlike other trumps that get so complicated sometimes that the amount of symbolism sometimes contradicts itself, like in the Lovers. But in the Hermit, because it's associated with Virgo and therefore Persephone, we have the myth of Persephone there in the card. The idea that Persephone is trapped in Hades, of course, having tasted of the pomegranate. And essentially the idea in this card is that at springtime, when she is rejoined with her mother, essentially she is led led back into the light of day by Mercury, the god Mercury. So the Hermit as a figure essentially represents the higher intelligence, or the higher will, the true will, if you will, of the if you will, of the individual, essentially being that mediating force that silently works to bring us out of the state of ignorance, which is Hades, into the light of day, which is gnosis, which is acknowledgement of reality and of the true self, which is essentially represented by the sun. And of course, the interesting thing here is that we have the sun. His lantern is literally the sun, but the lantern itself is in the shape of a diamond. Now, again, the diamond is a symbol of Keter, the first mover. But the idea is that the sun is the direct emissary of Keter in the material world, or in the conscious personality. And that essentially they are on different frequencies the same thing. That Keter is in a constant state of becoming and never will fully manifest itself, whereas Tiphareth is something relatively tangible. It's the vision of Keter for all practical intents and purposes, and this is what we mean when we say that Christ is the image of God. That Christ is God in manifestation, the Word made flesh, because essentially the idea is that by coming to Christ and by looking at Christ, we are essentially observing the Father in action. And in extension, subject to space and time, as I keep talking about in these videos, but it's very important, and it's also important as to why Christ dies the way he does on the cross. The cross is such a symbolic death because of the way the human body is extended on a cross. Even in physics, I mean, just to take a little detour quickly, in physics, there's the idea, this was on that Nova special on quantum physics and all that. That was very, very interesting. But they were talking about how if there was nothing else in the world for you to bear a relationship to, in other words, if only you existed, if you can conceptualize that, if you were in basically a void in which there was nothing else to say, I am 10 feet away from that object, essentially, if it were all blackness around you, if you moved around, you would not be able to really tell that you were moving around. But the idea is that because you have arms and you have limbs that have extended your sense of self in space, you would get the idea of motion and moving about, but you would not necessarily see that you were moving about. So now if you condensed yourself into an idealized being in which you had no extended self, essentially there would be no sense of space or time whatsoever, because there would be no motion and there would be no space to draw relation from. You would not be able to say, I am now 2 days away from this prior event, or you would not be able to say, again, I am 10 feet away from that object and 20 feet away from that object. So the idea is that Keter is kind of that state. Keter is the basis of consciousness, but is not an extension, and therefore is not subject to space and time and its limitations. Whereas Tiphareth is, which is why the idea of the Passion is about the humbling of God. It is forcing God to subject itself to the limitations of space and time, those being pain, dealing with other people and other influences, and death, ultimately. But the idea is that because it is God, it cannot ever really die, and eventually it returns again, is the idea. And this is also the idea contained in the fact that it's the sun. The sun is, of course, something that inevitably comes back no matter how much the ancients thought it was not. And of course, the big fear of this is in winter, when the days get shorter. And of course, with the return of spring and summer, the sun returns very triumphantly, which is, the festival of Sol Invictus, the victorious sun. celebrated by the Romans at the height of summer, is associated with the chariot, which is another kind of solar card, but it's the sun in triumph, Apollo in his chariot in triumph. Whereas this, the Hermit, just to return to what we are actually talking about, this is sort of the idea that the light of personal divine consciousness is that which bestows wisdom upon the individual, and is incredibly personal. I think the idea, that he is a hermit implies solitude and independence. So it's not unlike the Hierophant. This is a form of initiation that happens silently over time, over the course of one's lifetime, in a state of maturation, or rather in a process of maturation. It is very much associated with agriculture and the process of planting the seed and letting it bear fruit, also as Christ talks about in the Gospels. This, of course, connects to all the wheat on the sides, but the wheat is also associated with Persephone and Virgo. Now, the interesting thing, too, connecting him back to the Logos, is the fact that he has an ibis head, or ibis head, depending on how you want to pronounce it. The ibis was a bird that is, of course, associated with the god Tot in Egyptian mythology. And Tot is the god of writing and words, so he is essentially the Logos idea for the ancient Egyptians in their cosmology. So again, we have that. We also see that his body is sort of shaped. Sorry, I'm not used to mirroring against the camera. His body is shaped sort of like a yod, or yod. So again, he himself is also the secret seed contained within man, or anything really, any form of life. He has, by the light of his solar essence, which is much more balanced. Of course, Tiphareth on the Tree of Life is the source of balance and beauty and harmony. It is perfect harmony between the divine self and the lower self, but it is also a balanced state of passivity and action. It's not too passive, it's not too active, it's relaxed awareness before it is anything else, or rather more than anything else. And so by doing that, he has tamed Cerberus. He has descended into hell and has tamed the three-headed dog Cerberus. And the dog is looking in all different directions, and these are supposed to represent various functions of the lower self. I forget what they all are, but the one looking straight up in the middle is observation or something. The one with its mouth open is speech. And the one looking behind himself might be something like thinking or cognition. I'm making that up. He explains what they are supposed to be. Does he? Or no, I don't believe so. I think it's in Snuffin, which I might as well show you. This book right here. If you want a decent book on explaining this deck, I recommend this one. I do not recommend Lon Milo Duquette's book. Sorry, Lon, but your book is way too basic for that deck, and does not teach you a whole lot of anything. It gives you a lot of nice backstory about how the deck was created, and some very, very general ideas about Kabbalah and magic, but really not enough to get into that deck. Snuffin sort of writes his book with the assumption that you already know all that stuff, and he's going to tell you more about it. But even he doesn't tell you a lot about it. Right. So that's important about Cerberus, and again, the idea of taming the lower self and bringing it back into consciousness. This is also, just as another side note, very similar to the idea of Plato's cave allegory, the idea that all of us, or unenlightened beings, essentially are chained in a cave, and our captors have basically made a fire and are making shadow puppets on the walls in front of us. And because we've only ever been exposed to the cave, and we've only lived there, we believe that the shadows are real, that those are what constitute reality. But when we decide to finally take our shackles off, because we're not really chained all that tightly, When we finally decide to take these off and step outside, we see the sun, which is real, and we are kind of blinded by the light, so to speak, but we finally see truth and reality as it is. So again, this card is all about retreating into the self in order to bring about maturation and awareness of oneself and awareness of their connection to the world around them, but who they are as an individual. It's about taking a step back and analyzing, I think, because again, that mercurial aspect, that Virgo aspect, Virgo is the most analytical sign of all of them because of that mercurial aspect. She's constantly associated as, with analytical people, or rather, Virgos are usually considered analytical people. So it is a card about contemplation, about introspection, but it's also, the word yod also literally means hand. So I like to think of this card, sort of funny enough, as he's got the whole world in his hands, because the idea also is that he's adoring the Orphic egg. The Orphic egg here, in the partition there of the wheat, is a symbol of the manifested universe. But in this case, it is the subjective universe of the individual. Again, returning to the idea that the individual is the center of their own personal universe. And so, essentially, it's that idea that the hermit, being a representation of God, God the Father as the organizing and active and generative principle, essentially is the prime mover of that universe, in his act of waiting to see what it's going to develop. It is very much like the parables of Christ, in which he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who gave his field to his servants, and basically left, and upon coming back found that one servant had done really well with cultivating, another had done well but not as well, and then the third had done nothing at all, and eventually was cast into hell, or essentially outcast. Thou wicked servant and all that. I forget. There are a bunch of parables that Christ gives in the four Gospels that are very much along those lines. So it isn't necessarily just that, but it is the same idea. It's sort of like waiting to see what this Orphic egg, what this individual in his manifestation is going to actually produce as far as works. Again, this is another card in which we are talking about works in addition to contemplation. It's very, very interesting. I think the right-hand pillar and the cards coming from it have a lot to do with the idea of works, and the left-hand pillar has a lot to do with contemplation and minimalization. Again, another way of looking at it is the active life versus the contemplative life, but really the idea is that the true path of enlightenment is the middle path, as Buddha would say, where it's a combination of both. It's a fusion of both, where the two become absolutely integrated and synonymous with each other. And again, the fact that this descends onto Tiphareth is very relevant for that, bringing into balance the idea of divine purpose and contemplation and self-understanding, and understanding of the true self. Okay, I believe that's all I really want to say about this. There are, of course, a few other things that I could say. Also the idea that the fact that it's a hand is very much connected to the Logos, because the hand is the tool par excellence. And even if you think of Christ, Christ was a carpenter not because he was necessarily a literal carpenter, but because he is the Logos factor. He is the architect of the universe. And so therefore, of course, the prime allegorical job for Jesus would be a carpenter, someone who constructs things. It's sort of a no-brainer, but everyone wants to read the Bible so literally, when really it was just a way of basically allegorizing a lot of these principles and philosophies. So that's another thing I highly advise you, if you are remotely of the Christian disposition, If you're not, if that's totally okay too. But if you are, the best thing you can do for yourself, if you're interested in reading the Bible, is not taking it literally. Period. Because it is an incredible book. It is an incredible storehouse of wisdom, but not when you take it literally. As soon as you take it literally, um, you are essentially doing what Christ's enemies did to him in the Passion, because you are taking the loftiness of God and subjecting it to humiliation. That's another way of looking at it too. So I don't know, maybe I'm thinking of all this because I've got Easter coming up and Lent and all that. But anywho, all that aside, if you have any questions, comments, anything of that nature, please feel free to leave a thing in the bottom. All right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and all that. I hate when people advertise it, but it does help me out if you do. So thank you very much, and I will see you for the next card at a later date. Bye.